in the hour before dawn, when the city of Bath lies wrapped in November mist, steam rises from the ancient pools in patterns that seem almost deliberate, almost conscious, curling upward through stones that have witnessed 2,000 winters and 2,000 springs. And if you stand at the edge of the great bath in this liminal moment between night and morning, you can see how the vapor moves in spirals that follow paths invisible to the eye, rising through air that weighs heavy with moisture and time and the accumulated breath of centuries. The water itself maintains a constant temperature of 46 degrees Celsius, has done so since before humans walked upright, will continue to do so long after our cities have returned to forest. And there is something profoundly unsettling about this consistency, this refusal to acknowledge the passage of seasons or the changing of ages, as if the earth beneath were powered by some mechanism that operates on timescales we cannot properly conceive, that sees our entire civilization as merely a brief interruption in its eternal rhythm. How does water, emerging from stone, remember to remain precisely this warm? The question seems simple, almost childish. The sort of thing you might ask and then immediately dismiss with a confident reference to geothermal gradients and aquifer depths. But stand here long enough in the pre-dawn stillness. Watch the steam rise in those peculiar spirals. Feel the heat radiating from water that flows from darkness deep below. And the question begins to transform, begins to reveal layers beneath its surface. Innocence begins to suggest that perhaps we have been telling ourselves comfortable stories about things we do not truly understand. The Romans called this place Aquae Sules, the waters of Sul. And they built here not merely bathhouses, but temples. Not merely temples, but sacred complexes of such architectural sophistication that modern engineers examine the ruins and find themselves unable to explain certain features, certain choices, certain alignments that seem to serve no practical purpose unless one considers purposes we have learned to dismiss. Purposes that operated according to principles our textbooks have edited from history. According to the narrative we have constructed and polished and taught to school children for generations, the Roman baths at Bath represent a straightforward example of imperial engineering and religious syncretism, a place where practical Roman ingenuity met Celtic superstition and produced a profitable spa town that served both military and civilian populations from approximately 60 AD until the departure of the legions in 410 AD. after which the complex fell into disrepair and was gradually buried under medieval and Georgian construction, forgotten until systematic excavation began in the 1880s under the direction of Major Charles Davis, the city architect and engineer who first began to comprehend the true scale of what lay beneath Bath's streets. The Romans, we are told, discovered the hot springs that the native Celts had long revered, recognized their commercial and therapeutic potential, and set about constructing a complex that would channel the naturally heated water through a series of pools, tepidaria, caldaria, and frigidaria, creating a bathing experience that combined hygiene with social interaction and religious observance, all according to architectural principles documented in surviving texts, most notably Vitruvius's De Architectura, written in the 1st century BC and serving as the primary handbook for Roman engineering throughout the imperial period. The spring, according to geological surveys conducted over the past century, taps into an aquifer that begins as rainfall on the Mendip Hills some 15 kilometers to the south. Rainwater that percolates down through Carboniferous limestone to a depth of between 2 and 4 kilometers, where it is heated by the Earth's geothermal gradient to approximately 96 degrees Celsius before rising back through faults in the limestone to emerge at the surface at a rate of 1.17 million liters per day, cooling slightly during its ascent to arrive at the precise temperature the Romans found when they first encountered these waters, and the temperature that greets visitors today. But the word arrives quietly, almost apologetically, a small contradiction in the official narrative that most guides pass over quickly or explain away with references to advanced Roman engineering. But when Major Davis first excavated down to the level of the original Roman complex, he found something that troubled him enough to write about it in his personal journals, entries that were not published until decades after his death, entries that describe a moment of recognition, a moment when the confident archaeologist encountered something that made him question whether he truly understood what he was uncovering. Charles Davis was a man of his era, which is to say, a man who believed implicitly in progress, in the superiority of modern engineering over ancient methods, in the straightforward accumulation of knowledge through rational inquiry. And it was precisely this confidence that made his experience at Bath so unsettling, so difficult for him to articulate in official reports. Though in private correspondence with colleagues, he admits to a growing sense that the bathhouse complex was not quite what everyone assumed it to be. In the summer of 1885, Davis's crew was excavating in what would later be identified as the temple precinct adjacent to the main bath, removing layers of medieval debris and Georgian construction fill, when they encountered a bronze head, a gilded artifact of extraordinary quality, depicting a female face with features that seemed to shift depending on the angle of viewing. And Davis noted in his journal that evening that he had stood looking at the head for nearly an hour, unable to shake the feeling that it was looking back, that its eyes, though bronze and therefore lifeless, seemed to possess an awareness that made him profoundly uncomfortable. The head was identified as depicting the goddess Sulis Minerva, the hybrid deity the Romans created by merging their Minerva with the local goddess Sul. And it should have been a straightforward archaeological triumph, a beautiful piece to display and study and use to support the narrative of Roman religious practice. But Davis kept returning to certain details that seemed wrong, seemed calculated in ways that suggested purposes beyond artistic representation. The proportions of the face, when measured precisely, did not conform to classical Roman standards, did not match the documented ideals of beauty and proportion that Roman sculptors learned and followed with near mathematical consistency. And yet the execution was clearly the work of a master craftsman, someone who understood those standards perfectly and chose deliberately to deviate from them in specific, measurable ways, creating ratios that Davis began to suspect were not arbitrary, but rather encoded information of some kind, though he could never quite articulate what that information might be. He measured the distances between features, the angles of gaze, the proportions of the face to the head, and found recurring mathematical relationships, numbers that appeared again and again in slightly different contexts, numbers that seemed too consistent to be coincidental, but whose significance remained tantalizingly out of reach. And his frustration is evident in journal entries where he writes the same measurements over and over, as if repetition might reveal their meaning, might crack the code that he sensed but could not quite perceive. More troubling still was the context in which the head was found, sealed in a drain pipe that had clearly been placed there deliberately, not discarded or lost, but hidden, preserved, protected in a manner that suggested someone had known that a time would come when the complex would be abandoned, had planned for that abandonment, had ensured that certain key artifacts would survive the chaos in specific locations where future excavators might find them if they dug in the right places. Modern archaeologists, armed with technologies Davis could never have imagined, have returned to the Bath complex again and again over the past century, each generation bringing new tools and new questions, and each generation encountering fresh anomalies that resist easy explanation, that accumulate in the literature like sediment, building layers of uncertainty beneath the confident surface of textbook narratives. In 1972, a team from the University of Bristol conducted a comprehensive survey of the spring's flow rate, temperature, and chemical composition. Measurements taken hourly over a period of 18 months. And what they found was consistency that bordered on the impossible. Variations so minimal that the standard deviation was smaller than the margin of error in their instruments. As if the spring were not a natural phenomenon at all, but rather a carefully calibrated system maintaining precise parameters regardless of external conditions. They measured again, checked their instruments, brought in new equipment, repeated the study over another full year, and found the same results, the same uncanny stability. Water emerging from the earth as if following instructions, as if responsive to requirements we could not detect, but which governed its behavior with absolute precision. And the lead researcher, Dr. Margaret Holloway, noted in her published paper that the spring behaved more like an engineered system than a geological feature, though she softened this observation with speculation about feedback mechanisms in the aquifer that might produce such stability through natural processes. Geologists examining the fault structure through which the water rises have documented a series of channels and openings in the limestone that follow patterns they describe as curiously regular, as if the rock had been modified, as if someone or something had widened certain passages and sealed others to direct the flow precisely, to ensure that water arrived at the surface in the exact location and at the exact temperature required. And while geological processes can produce remarkable formations, the specificity of these channels, their deliberate seeming arrangement, continues to generate quiet debate in specialist literature. Chemical analysis of the water reveals a mineral content that varies from other hot springs in Britain in subtle but consistent ways. Ratios of dissolved solids that seem optimized for therapeutic purposes. Concentrations of minerals that modern spa treatment facilities spend considerable resources trying to replicate artificially. And yet here, the water emerges naturally with these precise proportions, as if the aquifer itself were a vast mixing chamber, producing a formula refined over millennia. The Roman lead pipes that carried water throughout the complex, excavated and studied in detail, show evidence of manufacture techniques that should not have been available in the 1st century AD. Precision in the rolling and joining of lead sheets that suggests tools and methods not documented in any surviving Roman text. And metallurgical analysis reveals a purity of lead that exceeds what Roman smelting processes were known to produce, suggesting either that our understanding of Roman technology is incomplete, or that these pipes were made using techniques borrowed from traditions we have not yet identified. Temperature readings taken at various depths in the bath pools show thermal stratification patterns that seem to defy normal convection. Layers of warmer and cooler water arranged in configurations that should not be stable, should not persist, should mix and equalize within minutes, yet remain distinct, remain separated as if held in place by forces more subtle than the simple physics of heat and density. And researchers who have spent months studying these patterns describe a growing sense that the bath operates according to principles not quite covered by standard hydrodynamic models. When you begin to examine the practical logistics of constructing the bath complex, the official timeline begins to strain, begins to reveal gaps and impossibilities that we have learned to ignore, have learned to paper over with confident assertions about Roman engineering genius. But the numbers resist such easy dismissal. The numbers insist on being taken seriously. The foundation of the Great Bath extends nearly 6 meters below the current ground level, resting on a bed of oak pilings driven into the marshy soil. Thousands upon thousands of trees felled and shaped and driven into the earth to create a stable platform. And dendrochronological analysis of surviving pilings suggests they were harvested and installed within a remarkably narrow time window, perhaps as little as 2 years, which would require a workforce of hundreds of skilled laborers operating continuously, a mobilization of resources that seems excessive for what was, at the time of construction, a relatively minor provincial settlement at the extreme edge of the empire. The lead lining of the Great Bath, when measured and weighed and calculated, represents approximately 48 tons of processed lead, an immense quantity that would require the output of multiple smelting operations working for months. And yet contemporary records make no mention of such production, no reference to the massive shipments of lead that would have been necessary, no documentation of the specialized labor force required to install sheets of lead with the precision evident in the surviving remains, where joints align with tolerances measured in millimeters, where water sealing was achieved through methods that modern restorers struggle to replicate even with modern tools. The columns supporting the terrace around the bath were carved from limestone quarried in the Mendip Hills, blocks weighing up to 3 tons each, transported 15 kilometers over terrain that was, in the 1st century AD, largely forested and lacking in proper roads, then lifted into position with an exactness that allowed for the elaborate architectural program visible in the ruins today. And while we can speculate about Roman lifting equipment and transport methods, the sheer scale of the operation the number of individual pieces, the precision of their placement, suggests a level of organization and capability that seems disproportionate to the strategic importance of this site in the broader context of Roman Britain. Modern engineering firms, when asked to estimate how long such a project would take using Roman-era technology and workforce limitations, consistently produce timelines that exceed the 15 to 20 years that archaeological evidence suggests the original construction required. And when pressed, project managers admit that certain aspects of the construction seem to imply either technologies not present in the archaeological record or organizational methods that coordinated labor in ways we find difficult to model. Methods that achieved efficiencies our modern project management techniques cannot quite replicate. The reservoir that feeds the baths, hidden beneath later construction and only partially excavated, contains water to a depth that varies by no more than 3 centimeters throughout the year, despite the varying demand from the baths above, despite seasonal changes in the spring's flow rate, despite centuries of sediment deposition that should have gradually reduced its capacity. And this stability suggests a design that anticipated variables far into the future, that built-in regulatory mechanisms we can observe in their effects, but cannot locate in the physical structure, as if the entire system were responding to sensors and controls that operate on principles we have not yet discovered, or perhaps have forgotten. When you step back from the engineering details and begin to examine the complex as a whole, from above, from the perspective of plan and layout and relationship between parts, patterns emerge that seem to transcend mere functional requirements. Patterns that suggest the builders were encoding information in the very arrangement of spaces and structures, using architecture as a language for concepts that could not be written in words, or perhaps should not be written in words, should only be preserved in stone and water and the relationships between them. The distance from the spring source to the center of the Great Bath measures 47.3 meters, and this number appears again in the relationship between the temple facade and the altar, and again in the spacing of columns around the terrace. And when you begin tracking these repetitions, these echoes of specific measurements throughout the complex, you find that they cluster around numbers that have significance in ancient mathematical and astronomical texts, numbers that appear in calculations of planetary motions and solar cycles, numbers that suggest whoever designed this place was working from knowledge that integrated architecture with cosmology, that saw no distinction between the practical and the sacred, between the functional and the symbolic. The floor of the Great Bath, when surveyed with modern laser scanning equipment, reveals a slight but measurable curve, a depression toward the center that is too subtle to detect by eye or even by traditional leveling methods, but which creates a shape that matches, with remarkable precision, the mathematical curve known as a catenary. The shape a hanging chain makes under its own weight when suspended between 2 points, a curve that has unique structural properties, and that would not be formally described in mathematics until the 17th century, more than 1,500 years after this bath was built. And yet here it is, incorporated into the floor with an exactness that cannot be coincidental. The acoustic properties of the enclosed bath chambers, when measured by sound engineers, show resonance frequencies that correspond to notes in the harmonic series. And when water is introduced into the pools at the levels the Romans maintained, the resonance pattern shifts in ways that create what acousticians describe as a sonic environment conducive to altered states of consciousness, frequencies that interact with human brainwave patterns in subtle but measurable ways. And while we might attribute this to fortunate accident, the consistency of these acoustic features across multiple chambers, each tuned to slightly different frequencies that together form a coherent harmonic sequence, suggests intentional design, suggests someone understood principles of psychoacoustics that Western science would not articulate for 2 millennia. The alignment of the temple to the spring, to the altar, creates an axis that, when extended, points to the position of sunrise on the winter solstice as seen from this latitude in the 1st century AD. And while solar alignments are common in ancient architecture, the precision here goes beyond symbolic gesture, continues through multiple architectural features that all honor the same orientation with a consistency that required constant surveying and adjustment during construction, required a commitment to this alignment that governed every aspect of the complex's layout. And the question becomes not whether the Romans cared about solar alignments, but why they cared so much, why they invested so much effort in achieving precision that served no obvious practical purpose. The ratio of the great bath's length to its width approximates the golden ratio, 1.618. That number that appears throughout nature in the spiral of nautilus shells and the arrangement of flower petals and the proportions of human faces. And while one might expect Roman architects to employ pleasing proportions, the exactness of this ratio, combined with its appearance in multiple other features throughout the complex, suggests it was not merely aesthetic preference, but rather a fundamental organizing principle, as if the designers believed this ratio had properties beyond beauty, had significance in realms we have learned to separate from architecture, but which they saw as inextricably linked. What remains absent from the archaeological record proves, in some ways, more puzzling than what has been discovered. For the gaps in evidence, the missing pieces, form their own pattern, their own testimony to something we have not quite understood about this place and its purpose and the knowledge of those who created it. No dedication stones have been found identifying the specific engineers or architects who designed the bath complex. No inscriptions naming the officials who authorized its construction. No commemorative plaques celebrating its completion. And this absence stands in stark contrast to Roman practice throughout the empire, where major public works invariably included multiple inscriptions documenting sponsorship, design, construction, and dedication, where officials competed to have their names associated with prestigious projects. And the silence. Here, the deliberate anonymity suggests reasons we can only speculate about. Suggests, perhaps, that credit was not important, or that credit belonged to sources that could not be named, or that the work itself was understood as something larger than individual achievement. Records from the Roman administration of Britain, fragmentary though they are, make surprisingly little mention of the baths at Aquae Sulis, despite what must have been significant public expenditure, despite the complex's obvious importance as evidenced by its scale and quality. And historians who study the provincial archives note this strange silence, this gap where they expect to find budget debates and administrative correspondence and the usual bureaucratic documentation that attended every major Roman project, as if the bath complex occupied some category outside normal governmental oversight, as if its construction and maintenance operated according to authorities we cannot trace in the surviving documents. The religious artifacts recovered from the site, while numerous and often spectacular, show an unusual pattern in their imagery, a tendency toward symbols that do not quite match standard Roman iconography. Variations in the depiction of gods and goddesses that suggest either local artistic traditions or, more intriguingly, systematic modifications of classical forms to incorporate meanings that have not survived in written sources. Visual languages that spoke to initiates but remain opaque to modern interpreters who lack the context, who lack the keys to decode what these images meant to those who created them and those who came to worship here. No operating manuals have been found, no technical documentation explaining how the complex's water systems were maintained, how flow rates were regulated, how temperature was controlled in the various pools, and this absence might seem unremarkable, except that the Romans were meticulous record keepers, except that we have surviving texts documenting the operation of far simpler bath complexes throughout the empire, technical guides and maintenance schedules and training materials for the slaves and freedmen who operated such facilities, and the lack of such documentation for what was clearly one of the most sophisticated bath complexes in the empire suggests either that the records were deliberately removed or that the operation was considered too sensitive to document in writing, requiring instead an oral tradition, a chain of teaching from one generation to the next that left no trace we can follow. The spring itself, when examined by hydrogeologists, shows features that resist incorporation into standard models of aquifer behavior, shows evidence of what researchers describe carefully as unusual stability in flow characteristics, avoids more direct statements about impossibility, but cannot quite hide their puzzlement at water that emerges from the earth with consistency that exceeds what natural systems typically achieve, that suggests monitoring and adjustment mechanisms operating far beneath the surface, systems that have maintained their function for at least 3,000 years and possibly much longer. Systems we can observe in their effects, but cannot locate in the geology, cannot explain through the standard narrative of groundwater percolation and geothermal heating. When you begin to examine other Roman bath complexes throughout the empire, searching for parallels to the features at Aquae Sulis, you find that while hot spring baths existed in many locations, the specific combination of architectural sophistication, water management precision, and religious significance appears in only a handful of sites. And these sites, when plotted on a map, form their own pattern, their own geometry, that suggests they were not independent projects, but rather nodes in a network, connected by something more than mere cultural exchange. The baths at Baiae in Italy, built over volcanic hot springs on the Bay of Naples, show similar precision in water temperature control, similar acoustic properties in their chambers, similar astronomical alignments in their layout, and archaeological analysis reveals that they were constructed within decades of the Aquae Sulis complex, possibly by some of the same teams of specialized engineers. And while official histories treat these as separate projects, the similarities in technique and design philosophy suggest coordination, suggest a coherent program of construction that spanned the empire and perhaps served purposes that transcended the official explanations of public hygiene and social gathering. In North Africa, the baths at Timgad show modifications to natural springs that parallel the work at Bath. Same careful channeling of water through limestone, same precision in temperature maintenance, same mysterious consistency in flow rates that persists to this day, despite centuries of neglect and the dramatic climate changes the region has experienced. And geological surveys, there report the same puzzlement, the same sense that these springs behave more like engineered systems than natural phenomena, and the same absence of documentation explaining how such precision was achieved or why it was necessary. The pattern extends to Asia Minor, to the thermal springs at Hierapolis, where hot water emerges from the earth to flow over white calcium carbonate terraces of stunning beauty, where the bath complex includes chambers with acoustic properties that match those at Bath, where the layout incorporates the same mathematical ratios, the same astronomical alignments, the same careful attention to proportions that suggest a template, a shared knowledge that was applied across diverse locations, adapted to local conditions, but maintaining essential features that someone, some organization, considered essential. What emerges from this pattern is the suggestion that the Roman bath complexes built on hot springs were not merely examples of engineering excellence, but rather elements of a system, a network of sites connected by shared knowledge and possibly by active communication. Places where water and architecture and acoustics combined to create environments with properties we have not fully recognized. Places that served functions beyond the social and hygienic uses recorded in official documents. Places that operated according to principles we have glimpsed only through their effects, through the anomalies that persist in the archaeological and geological record. The night sky above Bath in the 1st century AD looked significantly different from the sky we see today. For the precession of Earth's axis, that slow wobble that takes 25,920 years to complete a full cycle, means that the stars have shifted their positions relative to the horizon, means that constellations rose and set in different locations, means that anyone designing a structure with astronomical alignments would need to calculate not just for their present moment, but for the deep past or distant future, if they wished their alignments to have meaning beyond their own era. The winter solstice sunrise alignment of the Bath complex, when traced backward through astronomical software that models the precession of the equinoxes, reveals that it would have aligned even more precisely in earlier centuries, reaching perfect alignment approximately 2,000 years before the Romans arrived in Britain. In an era we associate with the construction of stone circles and henges, with Stonehenge itself located just 40 kilometers to the east. And the question becomes whether the Romans discovered a sacred site that had been in use for millennia and built their complex to honor its existing significance, or whether they possessed knowledge of the site's ancient purpose, knowledge that came to them through channels history has not preserved. The spring's emergence point, when examined in relation to the broader geological structure of the region, sits at a location that mathematical analysis suggests was carefully chosen, not merely for its water, but for its position in a larger pattern of sites that includes Stonehenge, includes Glastonbury Tor, includes other locations that have been sacred for millennia. And while we might attribute this to coincidence or to successive cultures, recognizing the same sacred qualities in the landscape, the precision of the geometric relationships between these sites, the way they form triangles and alignments that encode specific angles and distances, suggests intentional planning, suggests a civilization that thought in terms of continental geography and that marked the land with monuments whose relationships would be apparent only from perspectives we have only recently acquired through aerial surveys and satellite mapping. The constellation Aquarius, the water bearer, rises on the eastern horizon at dawn on the spring equinox as seen from Bath, a timing that would have been even more pronounced in the 1st century AD. And Roman texts associate Aquarius with healing waters and transformation, with the age that some mystery traditions taught would follow the age of Pisces. And while we cannot know what the builders of the Bath complex believed about astrological ages and cosmic cycles, the alignment seems unlikely to be accidental, seems rather to be a statement in stone and water about the site's relationship to vast cycles of time, to transformations that would play out over millennia. The depth of the aquifer that feeds the spring, approximately 3,000 meters below the surface, represents a journey of time as well as distance, for geologists calculate that the water currently emerging at Bath fell as rain between 4,000 and 10,000 years ago, has been moving through the limestone aquifer ever since, has been slowly heated during its descent, and more quickly heated as it approaches the geothermal gradient at depth, so that the water bathing your skin today is water that last saw daylight when human civilization was just beginning, when the first farmers were domesticating wheat in the Fertile Crescent, when Britain was connected to continental Europe by a land bridge that would soon be drowned by rising seas. And there is something profound about this temporal displacement, this connection to a deep past mediated by water that emerges forever warm, forever flowing, forever linking us to ages we can only barely imagine. To understand the Bath complex requires moving beyond its public spaces, beyond the Great Bath where tourists gather and photographs are taken, into the interior chambers, the smaller rooms where the water was darker, where the steam collected in thick clouds, where the architecture seemed to close around you, to create spaces that felt less like pools and more like caves, less like public facilities and more like temples, less like places for washing and more like places for transformation. The circular bath in the eastern suite, discovered during excavations in the 1980s, measures precisely 7 meters in diameter and is located in a chamber whose walls rise to a dome that creates an acoustic environment of profound intimacy, where even a whisper carries clearly around the entire perimeter, where sound seems to originate from everywhere and nowhere. And researchers who have studied the acoustics note that the chamber creates what they call threshold conditions, sound environments that parallel those used in meditation practices, in sensory deprivation experiments, in therapeutic settings designed to induce altered states of consciousness. And while the Romans certainly had practical reasons for building smaller, more intimate bathing spaces, the precision of the acoustic engineering here suggests purposes beyond privacy and comfort. The water in this chamber, fed by a secondary pipe from the main spring, enters at the bottom and rises upward, creating a gentle current that circulates in a clockwise pattern that researchers can measure, but cannot quite explain through simple hydraulics, cannot quite model using standard fluid dynamics, as if the shape of the chamber and the placement of inlet and outlet were designed to create this specific pattern, this slow rotation that would have carried bathers in a lazy circle as they floated, that would have created, combined with the acoustic properties, a profoundly disorienting experience, a sense of being suspended not just in water, but in some medium that transcended water, that became metaphor and symbol as much as physical substance. The temperature in this chamber runs slightly cooler than in the Great Bath, dropping to approximately 42 degrees Celsius, a temperature that induces relaxation without drowsiness, that can be maintained for extended periods, that sits at the boundary between hot and warm in ways that seem to dissolve the distinction. And ancient medical texts describe therapeutic bathing at this precise temperature range, describe it as optimal for conditions we might now call psychological as much as physical, conditions of stress and anxiety and spiritual malaise that the Romans treated with water and heat and the careful manipulation of sensory input. The walls of the chamber are lined with a reddish-pink stone, a type of limestone that contains high concentrations of iron oxide, and analysis of the stone reveals that it was quarried from a specific location in the Mendips, a quarry that was exhausted within a century of the bath's construction and never reopened. And this stone, when heated by the warm water and steam, releases trace minerals into the air, creates an atmosphere that smells faintly of earth and iron and something else, something organic and ancient that researchers describe but cannot quite identify chemically. An aroma that combines with the warmth and the acoustics and the slow rotation of the water to create an experience that multiple visitors across centuries have described as transformative, as providing insights or visions or experiences that resist easy categorization. The lighting in this chamber would have come from oil lamps, their flames creating movement, creating shadows that danced on the curved walls, creating an environment where vision became unreliable, where the steam and the heat and the flickering light combined to make it difficult to distinguish the solid from the ephemeral, the real from the reflected. And in such an environment, floating in warm water, breathing air heavy with minerals, hearing sounds that seemed to come from inside your own head, the boundaries between self and space would have grown permeable, would have allowed for experiences that contemporary psychology might categorize as dissociative or meditative or transcendent, experiences that were perhaps exactly what this chamber was designed to facilitate. Below the Roman levels, excavations in the late 20th century revealed earlier construction, hints of structures that predate the Roman occupation by centuries, foundations and post holes and drainage channels that suggest the spring was not merely discovered by the Romans, but had been the focus of organized activity for generations before their arrival, had been recognized and honored and built around in ways that left only fragments in the archaeological record, fragments that suggest knowledge we have not fully recovered. Ground-penetrating radar surveys conducted in 2003 revealed anomalies beneath the spring chamber itself, geometric patterns in the bedrock that appear too regular to be natural, that suggest either caverns modified by human hands or construction that extends far deeper than any excavation has yet reached. And while such surveys cannot distinguish clearly between natural and artificial features at depth, the patterns they reveal cluster around the spring's emergence point in ways that suggest intentional arrangement, suggest chambers or passages aligned with the water's flow. And archaeologists debate whether to excavate further, whether the historical value of such investigation outweighs the risk of damaging the spring's delicate hydrological balance. Sonar surveys of the spring itself, pushing instruments down into the opening from which water emerges, have mapped a channel that descends at a sharp angle for approximately 30 meters before opening into what appears to be a larger chamber, a space perhaps 10 meters in diameter, carved from or dissolved in the limestone. And this chamber shows features on the sonar returns that geologists describe as unusual, as not quite matching the patterns of natural caves in limestone, as showing regularities that might indicate modification. And the question becomes whether this chamber is accessible, whether it has always been flooded, or whether there were periods in the past when water levels were lower, when one might have descended into this space and stood in what would have been a cathedral of stone and rushing water and darkness absolute. Core samples, taken from beneath the bath foundations, reveal layers of organic material, remnants of wooden structures that radiocarbon dating places at approximately 3000 BC, more than 3,000 years before the Romans, more than 1,000 years before Stonehenge reached its final form. And these timbers show evidence of having been shaped, having been fitted together in what was clearly deliberate construction, though whether as a building or a platform or some other structure remains unknown, remains suggested only by fragments that raise more questions than they answer, that hint at a continuity of sacred use stretching back into the Neolithic, back to eras when Britain was occupied by peoples whose names we do not know and whose thoughts we can only infer from the monuments they left behind. Recent analysis using electromagnetic survey techniques has detected what researchers call conductivity anomalies, spreading out from the spring in multiple directions, following paths that seem to trace underground water channels, but which run too straight, too deliberately, to be explained by natural geology alone. As if the Romans or their predecessors had mapped the subterranean water flow and marked it, perhaps with metal rods or stone monuments now buried, perhaps with methods we have not yet imagined, creating a network that extends far beyond the visible bath complex, that connects the spring to other sites across the landscape in ways we can measure but not yet interpret. Each new scanning technology, each advance in archaeological remote sensing, reveals additional layers of complexity beneath the Roman ruins, additional evidence of earlier activity, of construction and modification and careful planning that extends back through time in layers we are only beginning to comprehend. And researchers describe a growing sense that what we see at the surface, magnificent though it is, represents only a fraction of the total complex, represents perhaps the final elaboration of a site whose true history reaches back to eras for which we have no written records, only stones arranged in ways that suggest meaning we have not yet learned to read. Geological evidence from cores taken throughout southern Britain reveals a period of dramatic climate upheaval approximately 5,200 years ago, a span of several decades when temperatures dropped suddenly, when precipitation patterns shifted, when the comfortable stability of the early Neolithic gave way to conditions that would have stressed agriculture, would have challenged survival, would have forced populations to adapt or relocate or perish. And it is in the immediate aftermath of this upheaval that we see the first major stone monuments appearing in the British landscape. First the timber structures, and then the stone circles and henges, as if the climate crisis had prompted a reevaluation of how to maintain knowledge, how to preserve through stone what might otherwise be lost in the chaos of social collapse. The hot springs at Bath, emerging with such reliable constancy from the earth, would have taken on profound significance in such a period, would have represented a source of warmth and healing that continued regardless of atmospheric conditions, would have seemed almost miraculous in their reliability. And it is tempting to speculate that the earliest structures around the spring were built not in times of plenty, but in times of desperation, were built by people who recognized in these waters a resource so valuable that it must be protected, must be marked, must be incorporated into whatever systems of knowledge and memory they could devise to carry forward through the crisis. Ancient flood myths are common throughout Britain and Europe. Stories of waters rising, of lands drowned, of survivors retreating to high ground. And while we have often dismissed these as primitive attempts to explain natural phenomena, geological evidence increasingly supports the idea that catastrophic flooding events did occur in the deep past, that rising sea levels following the last ice age drowned vast territories of what is now the North Sea, that Britain was severed from the continent, not gradually, but suddenly, through a massive flood that carved through the land bridge at Dover. And people who lived through such events would have carried the memory, would have passed down stories of the waters that came and destroyed the old world, stories that became myths, that became legends, that persisted through millennia, even as their historical basis was forgotten. In such a context, sites like Bath would have been understood differently than we understand them now, would have been seen as anchors of stability, as places where the earth itself provided resources that could not be drowned, could not be frozen, could not be taken away by any change in the heavens or the seas. And the effort invested in marking these sites, in building around them, in creating structures that would survive through time and carry forward their significance, begins to make sense, not as religious superstition, but as practical wisdom, as a form of insurance against catastrophe, a way of encoding in stone and water the locations that would matter most if civilization collapsed and had to begin again. The Bath complex, seen from this perspective, becomes more than a place for bathing and worship, becomes a library of sorts, a repository of knowledge encoded in its proportions and alignments and acoustic properties. Information preserved in forms that could survive the loss of literacy, the fragmentation of empires, the dark ages that periodically sweep across civilizations and force them to begin again from fragments, from memories half understood, from monuments whose meanings have been forgotten, but whose significance is preserved in their mere survival, in their insistent presence in the landscape, demanding attention, demanding interpretation, demanding that each new culture that encounters them ask why, ask what purpose drove the builders, ask what they knew that made this place worth such effort. The Romans, arriving in Britain and finding the spring already sacred to the local Celts, may have recognized in it something they had seen before, something they understood from their own traditions of sacred springs and underground waters, something that connected across cultures because it reflected not local superstition, but universal knowledge about how certain places in the earth could serve functions that transcended any single civilization, could provide continuity across the cycles of rise and fall that characterized human history, could be trusted to remain when everything else changed. Closing. The Eternal Watch, 157 to 170 minutes. Dawn comes slowly to Bath in November, the sun finding its way through mist that never quite clears, that hangs over the city like breath, like memory, like the accumulated presence of centuries layered so thick you could almost reach out and touch them. And the great bath fills with pale light that turns the green water to jade, to emerald, to something between color and luminescence. And the steam rises as it has risen every morning for longer than anyone can measure, rising in spirals that catch the light, that create momentary rainbows, that dissolve and reform in patterns that seem almost deliberate, almost conscious. The tourists will arrive in a few hours, guided groups moving through with cameras and audio guides, learning the official story, admiring the Roman engineering, standing at the rail and looking down at water they cannot touch, water that flows now as it has always flowed, 46 degrees Celsius, 1.17 million liters per day, constants that persist regardless of observation, regardless of interpretation, regardless of whether anyone believes or doubts or wonders about the anomalies in the historical record, the gaps in our understanding, the questions that accumulate like sediment beneath the confident surface of textbook narratives. But in this early hour, before the doors open, before the day's performance of public history begins, the bath exists in a state closer, perhaps, to what its builders intended, exists as pure phenomenon, as water and stone and steam and light, as a place where the deep earth gives up something precious, something it has held for thousands of years, releasing it here in this specific location for reasons geology can describe but not quite explain, releasing it with a consistency that suggests intention, even though we know the earth has no intentions, only processes, only the blind working of heat and pressure and time. The mathematics encoded in the structure's proportions remain whether anyone reads them or not. The golden ratios persist in the relationships between length and width. The acoustic properties function whether anyone listens carefully enough to notice them. The astronomical alignments mark the solstice, regardless of whether anyone stands at dawn to witness the sun rising precisely where the architects calculated it would rise 2,000 years ago. And this persistence of meaning, independent of interpretation, might be the deepest lesson of such places. The recognition that some knowledge was deliberately encoded in forms that would survive the loss of everything else, that would remain as mute testimony that someone, some culture, some civilization, understood that time moves in cycles, that knowledge is fragile, that preservation requires redundancy, requires encoding the essential information in multiple forms, in stone and water, and the relationships between them. You might spend your whole life studying this place and never quite comprehend what the builders intended, never quite crack the code they left behind. And yet the mere presence of the bath, its undeniable existence, its functioning still after 2 millennia, suggests that in some sense the preservation has succeeded. The knowledge has been carried forward, even if we cannot yet read it, even if we mistake the medium for the message, even if we think we are looking at bathhouses when we might be looking at something larger, something that used bathing as a framework for teachings we have not yet recognized. The spring will continue to flow long after we have gone, long after our civilization has left its own ruins for future archaeologists to puzzle over. And the water will emerge at the same temperature, will rise at the same rate, will maintain its chemical consistency regardless of whether anyone remains to measure it, to marvel at it, to build temples around it. And there is something both humbling and strangely comforting about this permanence, this indifference to human observation, this reminder that the earth operates on timescales that make our entire history into a brief moment, a passing season in cycles so vast we can barely conceive them. When you stand at the edge of the great bath in this pre-dawn quiet, watching steam rise through light that seems itself ancient, filtered through air that has known so many centuries, you might feel that you are standing not at a tourist site or an archaeological treasure, but at a threshold, a place where different layers of time remain accessible, where the Roman and the Celtic and the Neolithic press close against the present, where the boundaries between past and future grow permeable, where you might almost hear, beneath the gentle splash of water, beneath the whisper of steam, beneath the morning birds beginning their song, some older sound, some rhythm that predates language, some pattern that continues regardless of whether anyone listens, that will continue long after the last listener has fallen silent. The water touches the stones it has touched for millennia, wearing them smooth, molecule by molecule, year by year, creating a surface like silk, like skin, like something alive. And the process continues, invisible but relentless. And in another 1,000 years, the stones will be smoother still, will bear the touch of water, the way your face bears the touch of time. And someone might stand then where you stand now, might look at these same pools, might breathe this same mineral-scented air, might wonder, as you wonder what the builders knew, what they intended, what secrets they encoded in stone and water for future generations to discover or ignore or interpret according to their own understanding, their own needs, their own moment in the endless cycle of curiosity and forgetting. The sun clears the horizon, touches the columns with gold, and for a moment the entire complex seems to ignite, seems to remember its glory, seems to insist that it was built for reasons that mattered, that matter still. Even if we have forgotten what those reasons were, even if we have settled for comfortable explanations that avoid the deeper questions, the harder mysteries, the possibilities that make us uncomfortable because they suggest our knowledge is less complete than we pretend, our understanding less certain than we prefer. But the water knows nothing of our discomfort, cares nothing for our theories, continues its ancient work of rising and flowing and carrying heat from depths we cannot visit to surfaces we can touch, creating this intersection of deep and shallow, of darkness and light, of earth and sky, this place where transformation was possible, where healing could occur, where knowledge was preserved in forms that transcended writing, that required only presence, only attention, only the willingness to wonder what it might mean that water emerges from stone at precisely this temperature, in precisely this location, with precisely this consistency, century after century, millennium after millennium, forever warm, forever flowing, forever inviting us to immerse ourselves in mysteries we may never solve, but which persist in their invitation, gentle and patient and eternal as stone, as water, as the slow turning of the earth through space and time, and the endless dance of memory and forgetting that we call history, that we call progress, that we call understanding, while the water continues to rise, continues to flow, continues to steam in the morning light, indifferent and essential, obvious and inexplicable, simple and profound as breath, as sleep, as the gradual dissolution of questions into acceptance, of seeking into being, of wandering into quiet presence at the edge of ancient pools where nothing is certain except the warmth of the water, the coolness of the stone, and the soft insistence that some questions are not meant to be answered, but rather to be held gently, like mist in the hand, like steam rising, like memory dissolving into dream, into rest, into the deep quiet that lies beneath all stories, all explanations, all attempts to understand what the earth gives freely, what water carries faithfully, what stone remembers eternally. In this place, in this moment, in the endless, now where past and future meet and dissolve and become simply the presence of water touching stone, of light touching water, of breath touching air, of consciousness touching the edge of sleep, of wakefulness touching the edge of dream, of certainty dissolving into possibility, into potentiality, into the gentle darkness where all questions rest, where all mysteries wait, patient as stone, fluid as water, eternal as the turning of the world through night toward morning, through winter toward spring, through endings toward beginnings that are also endings, cycles within cycles, patterns within patterns, spirals of steam rising, rising, rising into light,